We're here with Don Campbell, who is the Emergency Manager at Guilford County, where we had a pretty significant tornado event on April 15th of 2018. Turned out to be an EF2 rated tornado with speeds of up to 135 miles an hour. Really significant event. One of the things that I thought was really unique about it was the area that it went through. It was a pretty urbanized area. And that made not only it difficult on the people there at the time, but afterwards trying to clean up and get resources to the area. So let's just start with some of the things that stick out to you about that day.
Yeah, sure thing. So we were paying attention to the storm a good bit because we had a pretty large event going on in town, the International Home Furnishings Market, and they had some outdoor concerts that day. So we were more attuned to the weather than we normally would be just because of the threat of outdoor events. And as we started to see it unfold, clearly it was not moving in the direction of the furniture market. But as we started getting the initial warnings of the tornado, it was pretty evident very quickly that we had significant damage throughout the entire process on a part of our community that typically has not really received that type of event in the past.
Well, as I was walking around, I remember just what a challenge it was to get in after the storm, as far as power poles being down. We had to ditch our van at one point. We had to walk several miles. There was a time when we had walked over some live wires that were still there. So you have issues. You have a lot of people in this area. They're trying to get out. They're trying to assess damage. They're trying to figure out how they're going to get out of this area. And at the same time, you've got live wires, you've got other organizations trying to get in to provide relief. So what do you think were the most difficult challenges about this event?
Yeah, I think so. Part of it was just the location that it happened in. Was that for us it is by far the densest populated area for us, and it's also very much mixed use. So you've got neighborhoods with businesses on either side of them and really interacting all throughout that community. And lots of old telephone poles and lots of wires that had been strung up multiple times. It just happened to hit one of the oldest sections of town, one of our most economically depressed areas of town as well, which meant that there was not quite the resiliency to bounce back initially from that event. So the best part about it was the community was ready to help. They were out in force for sure, but that definitely created some security challenges for us and safety challenges, really, just because there were so many people in that area, and like you said, live wires down, poles across streets everywhere. It was really a challenge to move in and out around the area.
Yeah, definitely. And given that it was such an urban environment, how has that affected the length of the recovery process going forward, and how involved are you in that at this point?
So we're now more than 6 months past the event, and we're still having bi-weekly meetings with community organizations to assist in that recovery process. There were over 1,000 homes that were damaged. Ultimately, in the end, there were probably over 250, 300 homes that ended up being destroyed or would not be rebuilt in that area, and for a lot of different reasons. And so there's really still a lot of community support to try to clean up homes. There's still homes with tarps on them today, some that don't even have a tarp on them because we still have yet to find the owner. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in that area, and really it's just because of where it was located and the community that it impacted.
One of the things I noticed, and what we actually used on the day of the survey, was Google Maps. You could watch the traffic pattern and see where the damage had occurred because it was all red, and that was from all the way up to the county line and beyond. Another thing I thought was interesting was I went back and looked at Google Maps, and since the tornado they have done another whole satellite image, and you can actually see the tarps in the image. It's really incredible to look at, and for me, it tells me just how long this recovery process has been. As meteorologists, that event is so far in the past for us that we don't think about it as much, but those communities are affected for a really long time.
They are, and one of the things that we identified, so in 2010 we had an F3 tornado go through High Point and do damage to about 675 homes. Well, just because the economics of the two different locations, we really didn't have that type of recovery challenge in High Point because most of the homes were new homes. They had good insurance on them, and insurance companies came in there real fast. in this Greensboro tornado, most of the homes had been there for 60, 70 years, were smaller homes. They didn't have a mortgage on them anymore, and so many did not have insurance or not enough insurance to really get that recovery started right away.
So in the immediate aftermath of the storm, what do you feel was it that people needed most, and what were the biggest challenges to delivering what they needed most at that time?
So the biggest need we had right away was shelter for people to stay in. Typically when these types of events happen, we have a handful of people who will go to a disaster shelter, but many people will go find a hotel room. Unfortunately, because the International Home Furnishings Market was in town, you couldn't find an open hotel room for about 35-40 miles.
Wow.
And so we really had to quickly open up a disaster shelter with the Red Cross and our partners, and that's by far one of our biggest shelter events to date, is just because there was such a need for safe and secure sheltering those first couple days.
Again, going back to the tornado in the urban area, two of the places that touched me the most surveying were the two elementary schools that were hit. My wife is an elementary teacher. She teaches 5th and 6th grade, and walking through the damage, especially the outbuildings at Hampton Elementary, and seeing a teacher's workbook that she had put so much time into, or beanbag chairs from the classroom that a kid sat in a couple of days ago. That was really heartfelt, touching to me. So, and then I learned that this recovery is really been hard on them, and it will take a lot longer than we initially thought. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so obviously that took place in April, and because of the damage at a total of 3 elementary schools, those 3 schools remained closed that school year, and most of it was due to water damage on the inside of the buildings, with a lot of roof damage that took place, and obviously the external buildings were pretty much all destroyed at that point in time. They have ended up, even this school year now, not opening those 3 schools again, mainly because the amount of damage that was done to them, it's a really complex process working with the insurance companies and bids and construction processes. But I think the bigger challenge that I've seen is just how much that has impacted those communities. Those schools had to be split into other elementary schools throughout the area, which meant that, and there was no school that could take them all, so that meant that some schools you split kindergarten through 3rd grade and 4th and 5th at another school, which means that you're splitting up families. And it has really been a challenge to sort of manage through that, and I think the anecdotal information that we're also getting from many of the teachers is the process of those kids not being able to come back together, spend time with their teachers and their friends, has continued to compound the concept of they lived in that area. And so now when they hear thunderstorms and rain, they start to have some challenges behaviorally. And so I think it's going to be, the buildings will get rebuilt. The children have got a long way to go for that recovery process.
Yeah.
And we're just very lucky that school was not in session on Sunday evening,
That's
and
right.
that the schools were empty. But it was definitely impactful regardless.
Yeah, I can't imagine what's going through the young mind like that, as they're separated from their friends and they're in a completely different community. Change can be really hard on kids, and I think a lot of times we look at the economic side of it, we look at the physical side of it, the building damage, but those kids, that's going to be a memory in their brain for a very long time, and think something that they won't ever forget, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And the school system did a great job of trying to make it as good as possible, and they really did some really neat things. When all the kids went to their new school about a week later, each of the local high schools had their marching bands out front and their cheerleaders out front. I mean, they really made it a community event and did absolutely everything they could, which was really helpful, really made those teachers and those students feel welcome, but it's still going to be a transition, and we're looking forward to hopefully getting them back in their schools in the near future.
And after an event like this occurs, an area is obviously more vulnerable to subsequent events that may happen. Are there steps you have to take on the EM side to account for that vulnerability going forward?
There are, and we unfortunately had to deal with that this year with the 2 hurricanes that we dealt with. As we were going into the planning for Hurricane Florence, while we were not by any means in the bullseye, we were still expected to get a good 8 to 10 inches of rain and good winds. And with a number of homes that still had tarps on their roofs, for the first time in our history, we opened up pre-event shelters. That's typically not something we do that far inland, but because we knew that there were so many people with still problems with their primary housing, we opened up a pre-event shelter and filled it up initially. And most of those individuals were survivors from the original tornado.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, and some of the most vivid memories I have of walking around after the storm was just how dangerous it was. That other High Point tornado you mentioned, ironically, is the first storm survey I ever did in the Weather Service. So I have the bookend experience there, and they were two very, very different events to even survey. I remember going back behind one of the schools to a little older house development that was there, talking to the family how they had been they got the warning, but they were taking shelter in this house that was built in the early 1900s. And, the people were okay, but they were found several hundred feet from where they were, which was really amazing to me.
Yep.
But, so that, thinking about that time immediately following the storm, how do you balance making sure that the environment is safe to go into versus the speed of getting people the relief they need?
Yeah, so it was definitely a challenge because that community, while economically depressed and had a lot of challenges to begin with, the sense of community was amazing. And so everybody goes to a neighbor's church, and there's really tight community. And so really there was no way to keep that community out of that area to help themselves or to help one another. And so we worked with our law enforcement partners to do our best to create as many perimeters as we could, but we never really were able to create a hard perimeter for that event, mainly because of how many roads were coming in and out, how many people lived in that area, and quite honestly, how many family members and friends were coming to help. And they did a great job of that help initially.
Yeah, and that's one thing I noticed on the ground. I've never been offered more bottles of water than that day walking around.
Yeah.
But we did notice those volunteer groups moving into the area. What would your advice be for groups like that who are trying to make a difference, but maybe there's also those concerns about safety?
I think part of it's twofold. One is the individual that just wants to go and help on their own. I would definitely say find a group, because many times the groups have pretty good ideas. They've got people that are trained in the safety elements, so they can at least give you a safety briefing and give you an idea of go do this, but stay away from this. So get a group, find a group, whether it's a church group, whether it's the Red Cross, whether it's Salvation Army, any of those nonprofit agencies do a great job. That's the biggest thing that we would say. And to those agencies we've got a great working relationship with. We can never move fast enough to make it safe for them to be able to get as early as they want to. It's a great problem to have, but a lot of times we just have to work and say, give us a couple more hours, let us make sure that all the lines are no longer energized, and that we get in there, because the last thing we want to do is get somebody injured as they were trying to provide relief.
Right. I know around the Triangle, a lot of communities have this CERT program, Community Emergency Response Team. Is there anything like that in the Triad that you're aware of?
We've got a couple of CERT teams in our area, none of them in the area that this tornado hit. And so, but quite honestly, the groups that came together were doing just as good as a trained CERT team would, and really worked hard through their faith-based organizations to make it work.
Now, kind of last question on the scene of the storm and stuff. Is there anything citizens can do in the aftermath of an event like this to make your job a little bit easier? Steps they could take or action they could take?
We received a lot of phone calls into our 911 center, a couple hundred in about 45 minutes. And I think what we like to say is call 911 if you have an emergency. If you are injured, you see somebody injured, if you've got truly an emergency. If you're calling just to tell us there's a tornado, we probably know that information at this point. But so that's an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
The other one, though, is, and the community did a great job with it, check on your neighbor. We've only got so many fire trucks and ambulances that are out there, but your neighborhood, the challenges that each of your neighbors have got. Check on them and take care of your neighborhood as best you can. We will get there.
Yeah, and that was definitely something, talking to people on the ground there, that once the event happened, they really were a tight-knit community. They did that. We heard stories about going to check on people who were, stuck in a bathtub or things like that, with only 2 walls of the house left, but
Right.
they heeded those warnings. They heard the message, and they were safe, and they're alive today, and that's the most important thing. And I think that's amazing too, that a storm can go through an area like that, and you can say all you want about the number of people, the economic depression, things like that, but they got the message, and they're all alive. We had one fatality that was distant from the storm and not related, but otherwise no fatalities. Really amazing.
Yeah, we were really impressed with how that worked and how the community reacted when they saw the event happening.
Great. I want to shift gears a little bit here and talk more about the weather side of things and products and stuff that you look at. So we just want to get an idea, where to get your weather information from, and what is your process for making sure that you're weather aware, especially in a short fuse event like this, where you've only got maybe a couple days to spin up. So what are the types of things you look at?
Yeah, so for us, we're constantly keeping an eye on the Storm Prediction Center's day 1, 2, and 3 outlooks. That just sort of gives us a general game plan of whether we need to pay attention a lot or pay attention a little bit. We use the briefings both from the Raleigh office and from the Blacksburg office, since we're right there on that borderline, as early heads up. And that's a great way for us to get a good idea of when we really need to ramp up resources, or more importantly, just start monitoring the radar ourselves and listening to the radio. And so we sort of use those tools to figure out what types of resources we need to get on standby.
Right. Awesome. Now, how would you characterize the relationship between emergency management and the NWS? This is definitely something that, we are trying to strengthen through initiatives like Weather Ready Nation. We're seeing this shift from science and forecasting. There's more of an equal goal now of science and forecasting. Yeah, that still has to be there, but you also need the customer service side of it. We've compared it to a restaurant a lot of times. You can go to a restaurant, and if the food is great, that's fine, but if the service is no good, nobody's going to eat there.
Right.
And vice versa. So, how would you characterize that relationship, and what is most helpful to you, and what could we do better?
Well, I think for us, the ability just to pick up the phone and call somebody, and when that person answers on the other end of the phone, they typically know our name. That's definitely a huge benefit. It's a comfort level as well. The weekly briefings are helpful for us to kind of get an idea of what do we have on tap coming up that week. It's a good sort of early heads up as to, again, when we need to pay attention, when we maybe don't need to pay attention as much. And then the briefings, whether they're single slide briefings or whether they're the full webinar, 1 or 2 a day, I think all of those help go into our decision-making process. And the more we've done it, and we've had an opportunity to do it a lot here lately, the more comfortable we get with that process, and the more comfortable our stakeholders and our elected officials get that we're getting good information and our recommendations are on par.
Is there anything that you don't get that commonly comes up as like, we could really use something right now, or a decision point that comes up, and whether it's timing or whatever, that maybe we could do better?
I think we've sort of adjusted things over the years as to making sure the briefings are really answering the questions that we're looking for. So, for the most part, I think we've dialed into what we are really needing. We would always love it earlier and sooner and more accurate, but until you find that crystal ball, it's hard to do that. But no, I think overall, we've been very happy with the resources we're getting to be able to make actionable decisions.
Great. And as far as those weekly briefing goes, we're kind of experimenting here with whether that once at the beginning of the week is enough. We're in December now, we're dealing with winter storms, and we have a weekend storm coming up. Would there be a benefit to maybe a Thursday briefing as well, as in addition to maybe a twice weekly?
So the weather briefing, at least for us on Monday, is helpful. We don't necessarily always get to get on it live, but at least we get the slides and the recording, so we can take a double check at that. And that helps us sort of get a game plan of when we need to pay attention. And so I think, using this week as an example, we had the one on Monday, and then since there is a storm coming in this next upcoming weekend, the addition of those daily briefings has really, that solved the problem for us and really given us the information we need.
Great. So what would you say are like the weather products you routinely look at the most? Especially particularly, you mentioned the Storm Prediction Center outlooks for the tornado event. Is there anything else other than the briefings, or are you more reliant on us to put in the briefing what you think you should see?
So, good question. So I think for us, we'll use the SPC to sort of give us an idea of, okay, when do we need to pay attention? And then as we start moving into that, normally it's about timed when you guys are putting out a hazardous weather outlook. And so normally those start to give me an idea of, okay, yes, I do need to care about it. And then typically when I see those, I'll start diving in a little bit more into your discussion products, just so I have an idea of the thinking, because we get questions a lot of times, well, maybe the weather service doesn't line up exactly with the local TV meteorologist. And at least some of those documents give me an idea as to, maybe I can speak more clearly to our elected officials as to why and how that process works. So, you know, in the wintertime, we've got to make decisions on special warming shelters and stuff like that. So the hourly process is pretty good as well through the website. So we use a lot of the products on a pretty regular basis.
Excellent, excellent. Now, you talked about picking up the phone earlier and having somebody on the other end that knows your name. Can you think of a time or a type of weather event where maybe having somebody physically in the building would be beneficial?
Yeah, one of the most recent hurricane that we went through, Hurricane Michael, I think surprised us a little bit. And not that it wasn't forecast, because it was definitely well forecast. I think for us, we were surprised in that event how quickly that went from a typical afternoon to that round of 40 to 50 mile an hour gusts.
Yeah.
And I know that you guys saw it. You mentioned it on a briefing earlier that day. But having somebody there in our EOC during that time frame, we had 3 or 4 reports of tornadoes from responders at that time. And I called the office, but it was a little harder to relay that information with the amount of stuff that was going on. So that would have been an event where I think, hindsight being 2020, would have been good to have somebody there in the EOC.
Yeah, that event was insane with the wind on the backside as it was going to extra tropical. Don, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to do it.
It's been great talking to you about the event, and we look forward to continuing strengthening this partnership that we have. And moving forward, we really hope that that community can find the relief that it deserves after this long period of time.
Thank you guys.